Hi there and welcome back to the Every Animal franchise zoo in Planet Zoo. Concept of this zoo is that we're adding every animal from Planet Zoo into a franchise mode game, and we're doing that in alphabetical order. Last week we finally got to the end of the A's, and this week we are on to the B animals, making good progress. This week there's 10 new animals going into the zoo, and that's spread across 4 new enclosures, so quite a lot of combo animals as well. We've moved across to the other side of the zoo from what we were working on last week. The first enclosure is for the Capuchin Monkey and the Baird's Tapir. The Capuchin Monkey and the Baird's Tapir are tropical animals, so it's another tropical enclosure. They don't need a lot of room, so they fit nicely in this corner. I've started with the hard shelter on this habitat because it's going to be built into the barrier. It'll be a double height wooden log wall, and for this enclosure, because the Capuchin monkeys can climb, I've got to be really careful about the pieces I use. Make sure not to use any climbable wood pieces. A good tip for this, there's some really nice wooden pieces that are flexicolour that have been added with both the conservation pack and the twilight pack. So if you're looking to make enclosures that can't have animals climbing up them, a really good idea for that is to use both of those packs and the wooden pieces there to make these. The biggest issue I've had with this enclosure was that the Capuchin monkeys need 8 monkeys to be happy for their social needs. That's a lot of monkeys. We've got 30 or so species now into this zoo, and that's definitely the most I've seen so far on the needing animals in there for the social group. Decoration-wise, there was a couple of things I needed to consider. They like a lot of soil, both of these animals. The tapirs need water, so I had to add a little pond, and the capuchins need a climbing requirement, so I tend to go with the climbing frames that are in-game because I'm not very good at making climbing frames. Seriously, if anyone watching this wants to make me some custom climbing frames, I'd be happy to add them to the game. You'll get credit for it, of course. I always have trouble if I make them myself. The animals are walking up them all backwards and weird, or they refuse to use them at all because I haven't considered the hitboxes. So yeah, I've added a lot of vegetation to this one as well. Both the capuchins and the tapirs are happy with thick vegetation, which is always good. And this is the final result. It's flush with the guest path on 2 sides, and yeah, in-game climbing frame here would look so much better with a custom one. Alas, if I could make them. I found that the monkeys love sitting in the little buttercups here on this side. Tapirs, I think, are a little overwhelmed by the sheer volume of monkeys compared to them. Inside the hard shelter, I've put the feeding stations for the monkeys in here. With the feeding stations, I'm not sure if anyone else has this problem, but if I put the feeding stations on anything other than the ground, these sort of wooden feeding stations, they won't fill them up, so it's a bit weird really. I wish we could raise it off the ground and make a feature out of it. The second climbing frame in here, I've tried to make a little bit of feature out of it, raised it off the ground a bit with some rocks. Other features, now this tree. I had this tree against the hard shelter, and unfortunately the monkeys were climbing up it and escaping off the roof, so we had to move that. Aside from that, everything else is working spectacularly, so a nice, medium-sized, I guess medium effort, I suppose, habitat built there. With that, it's time to move on to our second build today, and if we scroll down the list, that'll be the Bengal Tiger. Doesn't get any enrichment from habitating with any other animals, so we don't have to worry about that. Space-wise, there's only 2 of them housed together, so not a very big enclosure. Not tiny, but not huge. And I wonder, I think we could potentially fit it right next to the tapir and the capuchin monkey here. I think it'll fit in this sort of space. So here goes, Bengal Tiger enclosure. Because this is a long and narrow habitat, I'm going to do another raised viewing area. And this is sort of a double feature because the one next door is going to be the same, I reckon, whatever we put next to this. So it's kind of a raised walkway between the 2 of them. It's a concept that might work, it might not. I guess we'll see. Bengal tigers, I believe these guys live in kind of mixed terrain, so some lowland, some highland. So I've gone with a concept here of raising the terrain and making it quite rocky, make it look like sort of like the cliff on a valley or something. For this, I've used the terrain stamp to get a general shape and then smoothing that out with the good old traditional terrain tool. I do find it quite therapeutic shaping the terrain, kind of like playing with plasticine or clay or something. It's quite nice. For the rock work was quite important in this enclosure because that's what I'm relying heavily on to theme it. So it's a mixture of faux rocks and I believe it's Tiger rocks or maybe it's temperate. I can't remember which one I use now. But I did spend quite a lot of time fiddling with the rock work to get this right. The barrier is a custom mesh panel fence with a little protected barrier in front of that. Bengal tigers can jump 3 meters high, so you have to be very careful and make sure this is covered all the way around to that height. The hard shelter, I've built this so it's parallel height with that raised walkway that we put in before. The viewing area for guests around the front isn't that great because of what we're dealing with in terms of the shape of this habitat, so I thought it would be good to have somewhere where guests can view them inside the hard shelter if they are going to spend some time in there. I actually built this into the raised path as well underneath so that we're making use of every available space here for our tigers. It was nice that it fits in seamlessly with the path underneath too. That's the 2 tigers in. We ended up with 1 white one and 1 traditional coloured tiger, so bit of a mixture there. These tigers were also a very soil heavy creature. I was able to fit in a little bit of grass there and some rock work as well. They do like rock, which fits in nicely with that little underground bit, but it's predominantly soil. For the plants and trees, now the Bengal tigers do like a lot of plants and trees in their enclosures. The issue with this one is that we weren't blessed with the luxury of space on this enclosure either. When you're going with an enclosure that isn't very flat, you're always playing the risk that you're going to run out of space because once you put all the hills and the rocks in, that creates a lot of space that the animals can't navigate and it really reduces the navigable area that you have for the enclosure. So in terms of the trees and the plants, I went with low-lying plants because I knew that would mean that the animals could get by it, that it wouldn't affect their navigable area. So this is how it all turned out. We've got the front viewing area here, then there's the viewing area up at the back as well. Quite compact terrain here, I will say. There is just enough room for our 2 tigers here. They may struggle once they start having cubs. We may have some issues with space. I've had to spread the enrichment items out where the tigers could actually reach them. The terrain is really tricky on this one. So yeah, we've got the scratching post here up at the back. Nice view for the guests though, where they can see this on when they're on the path. Oh, here we go. Right, so yeah, the tigers can get on the roof. That's why I've added the fence at the back there. I debated fixing this, but then taking account of the space issues, screw it, let them go up on the roof if they want to. It's a nice view for them at least. The lower viewing area for this habitat worked out quite well. It does fit in quite well with the pathing I've got here, and it's another bit of like darker space underground for the tigers to reside in. I did originally have this made into a bit of a cave, but the tigers couldn't navigate through it. They're just too big. Their hitboxes were too big, so alas, I had to remove that, and now it's just an open underground area. I'll live with it. That's it for Bengal tigers, so on to our next habitat. Next up is the Binturong, and the Binturongs can be housed with a number of animals, but since we've already added the Asian otter and the Malayan tapir, that leaves them with the sun bear. So next habitat indeed will be Binturongs and the sun bear. This is going to be quite a large enclosure, so fingers crossed we have room in this space next to the Bengal tigers here will be enough. To get an idea of what I should do with the landscape for this habitat, I did look at some reference material online of what's out there in the real world, see how zoos are housing sun bears in real life, and I did find some examples of where they are housing sun bears and binturongs in the same enclosure in real life as well, so that was pretty cool. What I found with this was that a lot of them were using quite steep terrain. So I've replicated this in my habitat, so this is quite an ambitious terrain shaping for this habitat, definitely. A big feature of this is the natural cave that I'm putting in right slap bang in the middle at the front. This is something I found in the real life zoos, albeit they were a lot smaller than this, but with Planet Zoo we have the hitboxes to contend with, so you've got to be careful you don't make them too small and the animals won't use it. The barrier for this habitat, it's a custom barrier, and it's a bit of a mix really. For some of it, I've got this East Asia stone, the very rustic looking stone with the base game. For other parts, I've got the mesh fencing again, and there's a mixture of concrete in there as well. Like with the tiger, this is quite high because for some reason the sun bear needed quite a high barrier. Not sure why. I wouldn't have thought a bear could jump very high. I know it can climb, but apparently they can jump as well. Rockwork is mostly faux rocks in this one because I wanted a very specific colour for the rockwork, and you can only achieve that from using the faux rocks. I've also got in a little ramp made of concrete because I know what the animals are like, and if I was to put rockwork all the way down here, they probably wouldn't be able to navigate the terrain. So just adding that little ramp there with the concrete means that they can get through to the very bottom tier. Spent a little more time doing the rockwork around the cave because I wanted to make sure this looked like a man-made cave. So it's a deliberate cave that we've made in the zoo for the bears to sleep in. I made this using the East Asia beams, which is a lovely piece in the game. I use this all the time for anything you want to look a bit rustic and old, but very sturdy stone. So animals are in, and then the fun begins trying to figure out the terrain. Sun bear and binturong are Asian animals that can tolerate both tropical and temperate climates. So for this one, I made a decision just to go with the temperate because we've done an awful lot of tropical animals lately, and just to break up the space a bit, make it look a little bit different to what we've done for the last 3-4 enclosures. They're both animals that hail from sort of forestry kind of biome, so lots of trees, lots of plants. Wanted to make it look a little bit like a temperate woodland. One additional feature that I did spend time trying to make was I have a custom tightrope walk here made out of the natural rope and some of the logs in the game. They've yet to use this though, so it could be that they can't walk up it. I'll have to figure that one out. And here's the finished result. Oh, looks like rain is on its way, so I'll have to speed through this walkthrough quite quickly so we don't get stuck in the rain. Quite a large enclosure considering the amount of animals that are in there. This is the beaver pool that apparently the sun bears can use, but I think the rockwork that I've put around it is preventing them from using it because they've yet to dip their paws in there, so I need to check that out, figure out why they're not using it. Gotta say, I've probably neglected the binturongs a little bit in building this enclosure because the sun bears have so many more needs. I've put some hard shelters up at the back here, themed it a little on the Asian front there. Down at the front, we've got the concrete platform there with the water pipe on. Need to check that. There's a bit of a mismatch on the levels there to get it flush with each other. Oversight on my part there. Overall, I'm happy with how this has turned out. I really love the cave that I've put in. I think it looks really good once I've added all the rockwork and the flora and fauna around it as well. I think it's a really good feature there. Looks like we've got a binturong going for a bit of a snooze in the cave. Nice, exactly what I wanted. Anyway, that is the Binturong Sun Bear habitat done. Well, on to the next one. Our next habitat is a very mixed bag. We're working with the black wildebeest. They get enrichment from a heap of animals, and this took a lot of work figuring out which animals will work best with which other African animals. Figuring this out on my spreadsheet again. For this one, we're cramming in the black wildebeest, blue wildebeest, sable antelope, springbok, and the Thomson's gazelle. That's going to need a lot of room. This corner piece that we've got left here, it's just not going to work. It's just not big enough. I think we need to go over the road, and I reckon we'll be using this whole side here. I think the whole thing's going to be used up. But before we get working on that, because we've added so many exhibits today, we need more facilities because the guests are going to be complaining super hard soon that they haven't got anything over here. I'll go ahead and build that and cut back when it's done. Okay, so I've been working in the background, and before I got started on this huge enclosure that needs building, I've made a raised walkway and attached to that quite a few amenities. This is double height, so guests should definitely not be complaining about the view up here of the animals below when we add those. Down below, we've got our very first restaurant in this zoo. I'm kicking myself I didn't think to add a restaurant before. This is super helpful with the complaints of being hungry and thirsty. The restaurant takes care of both of those needs at the same time. It's a game changer. It's loosely themed in a light plaster African kind of themed way. 16 tables in total, so lots of room. Attached to this, I've got the usual things that are needed. So 2 toilets, because 1 toilet is never enough, apparently. Next to this, we've got another exhibit box put in because there is another exhibit species coming up that themes in with this a little bit, coming up very soon. So yeah, I've put that in ahead of time. Won't spoil the surprise, but next episode, we will have another exhibit animal in here. With the new restaurant and adjacent facilities in, I can't put it off any longer. It's time to build this massive enclosure for all of these grassland animals. Gotta say, because there's 5 different species going into this enclosure and they're all savanna, grassland, flatland animals, I was somewhat overwhelmed with this task. I've never built an enclosure to house 5 animals before, and it was quite challenging. To help me along with this somewhat, I've taken inspiration from some of my previous habitats for these type of animals. The concept basically is that it needs to be dry grassland. So I've gone with light colours, a lot of light plaster, utilising the conservation wooden pieces because that's flexicolour and I could make it a bit lighter and brighter to fit in with the lighter plaster colours. The fencing at the back and the shelters, I borrowed these from previous custom shelters and fencing I'd made for my starter habitats. When you're working with the grazing animals, they don't have a lot of wiggle room for having different terrain and rock work, so it's all very minimal on that front. So let me show you the final result. As you can see, this is a very busy enclosure. It's huge. And it's filled to capacity because lots of these grazing animals, they need lots of their same species to be happy in here. The black wildebeest is particularly fussy and needs 1 male and 6 females in the enclosure, so we are quite busy in here. The fauna and flora, it's quite minimal considering the size of the enclosure, but I've pushed that to the maximum that some of the animals could tolerate. They clearly like their space, so I've done what I can with it. It does look a little bare. I've broken up the space with some rocks, and of course we've got quite a few of the hard shelters at the back because there's so many animals, they needed quite a lot of hard shelter space. What I like is that I've managed to integrate this quite well with that earlier facilities section I made and the overlook there. The habitat's working quite well with that light, airy, hard shelter, grasslandy feel that we've got going on with the facilities. If we go and take a look up the stairs, as you can see here, there are people using it for looking at the enclosure. So they are using it for what I intended it to be used for. So that's good. This means it's time to move on. Next animal time. A nice enclosure coming up. It's black and white rough lemur. Quite exciting is that all of the lemurs in the game can be housed together and they all can have a walk-through enclosure. We've not tackled one of those yet in this zoo, so I'm tempted to have a look at that. Something we need to consider though with that is that space, they're going to need a bit more space if you're doing the walk-through one. I had an idea that I'm trying to fit in the lemurs in this corner over here. I mean, we've got this nice little space left over, but is that going to work with a walk-through enclosure? Alas, you will have to wait for next episode to find out whether we achieve that or not. I think we squeezed in quite enough exhibits for one episode. That's 4 new exhibits, 10 animals, and a restaurant. I'd say we've done rather well today. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed it. I'll see you in the next one.